I see people are still joining, so I'm going to give it a couple more minutes, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, so far we have 2 attendees, Ryan and Cerulli. It's good to be loved.
Oh, there you see. And Spencer. Oh.
So people are still trickling in. I'll give it another 30 seconds, and then we'll get started. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Samantha. I am the Director of Marketing at Pay. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, Pay is a fintech company based out of New York City. And our mission is to provide e-commerce merchants network-level security solutions to fight fraud. So before we get started, I'd just like to encourage everyone to ask questions in the Q&A panel. We are also accepting questions via email. You can email us at info@pay.co. That's info@paay.co. I know sometimes people feel more comfortable emailing us directly with their questions. All right, I think that's it. If we don't answer your question during the webinar, we will address all questions at the end during a Q&A period. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our CEO, Yitz Menlowitz, and our CTO, Adam Gluck. They will be leading the discussion, and I'll let you guys take it from here.
Thanks, Samantha. So just a quick introduction about myself. My background is in payments for about 10 years. It's mostly been focusing on the remote commerce and authentication side of things and seeing how we can help merchants live in that environment.
My name is Adam Gluck. I've been with Pay since February. Before that, I had a long career at Mastercard. I was the product manager for Mastercard's EMV offering, MChip. I actually created the name MChip way back in the day. I as part of that role, I chair the subcommittee on the common payment application. I worked on Mastercard's transit initiative, which led to the new MTA RFP and helped transition that industry away from private label cards to open payment systems. In my last role at Mastercard, I was one of the first product managers for Mastercard's MasterPass wallet. Since joining Pay in February as CTO, I'm excited to be here.
All right, thanks, Adam. It's quite the background. So this number here, $490 billion, is the expected cost to remote commerce merchants in the card not present world for fraud over the next 5 years. That's just an estimated cost. At this point, there's a good chance it's gone up. And the interesting thing about that number is that majority of the cost there, anywhere on estimate between 75 to 80% of it, is actually based on something called friendly fraud. Now, friendly fraud it's anything but friendly. What it literally means is, it means that I make a transaction and then I claim I never authorized it. So the example I typically like to use is, let's say, an online furniture company. They generally have very strict return policies. So once you sign for the item, it'll be, let's say, a 30% restock fee. So imagine I wanted to buy this couch. So I go to a website, I find the couch I like for $1,000. I ship it to my house. I sign for it. I put it in my living room, and I'm waiting for my wife to tell me how much she loves it. She comes in and she's like, I hate this couch. There's no way we're keeping it. Please call the merchant and have them take it back. Now, at that point, I know if I call up the merchant to take back the couch, they're going to charge me $300. I don't want to pay $300 for a couch I'm not keeping. So what I end up doing is I call up my bank and say, hey, I never authorized this transaction. My thought process there is, let the merchant come get the couch. I'll get my money. We're both mostly happy. No one's really getting screwed. But ultimately, the merchant's out the money. They're out the item. And the worst part about this type of fraud is there's actually no way to prevent that type of fraud from happening. Because if you think about it, everything about the transaction is legitimate. So I made a legitimate purchase. I was a legitimate buyer. I shipped it to a legitimate address. I signed for it legitimately. The fraud is when I called up and said, hey, I never authorized this transaction, that I actually did. And this is a problem that generally only lives in the remote commerce world. In the brick and mortar world, outside of the cost the merchants pay for the actual terminals and the interchange fees that they do, that's the only real cost that merchants burden in the card present world. That's why if you walk into a store to make a purchase, generally they're not going to do anything to see if that's actually your card, because ultimately they don't care. It's not their problem at that point if it's a stolen credit card. It's the issuing bank's problem. And to understand this, why this is like this, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. So credit cards were created 70 years ago. And when it was created, the concept in those days, there were in essence two types of transactions: card present, which meant I physically had the card, and card not present, which if I was a merchant, I was either taking a payment over the phone or the cardholder didn't have the actual payment with them. And they were manually keying in the transaction. Now, when the card brands created these rules, they realized like card present is the lowest risk. So these are the types of transactions we want merchants to make. So in the event that it is a fraudulent transaction, it's actually going to be the issuing bank's problem to pay for it. And the merchants will pay the lowest interchange rate. Card not present, they're inherently considered riskier transactions, and they wanted to dissuade the merchants in essence from doing these types of transactions. So they said, you're going to assume the liability, and on top of that, you're going to pay a higher interchange rate to absorb some of the costs that the issuers are going to see when those cards are stolen. And that worked great for the next 40 or so years until e-commerce came along. And e-commerce started off as just desktop commerce, and over the last almost 30 years has evolved to mobile, voice-activated transactions, Internet of Things. And it has been slowly growing single digits. In 2010, it was roughly around 5% of the total commerce market. And in 2019, it made up over 15. It was about 16 to 17% of the entire commerce market. And what's happened over the last 2 months is like completely unprecedented and has accelerated that growth significantly. In 2019, they did almost $2 trillion worth of transactions. and that's grown 32%. That's expected to grow 32% in 2020. In the last month alone, we've seen Mastercard had actually announced that 50% of their transactions in April alone was card not present. That means an industry that had previously been seeing single digits growth had grown by almost 40% from a year earlier. And while we estimated over the next 5 years, remote commerce will exceed brick and mortar, that's accelerated significantly because of the stay-at-home. And at this point, it wouldn't be surprising to see it actually overtake in-store card present. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to give you a little bit more history about the system.
Thanks, Yitz. So the payment system is fundamentally premised on the fact that the person that can mitigate the risk should mitigate the risk. And if they don't do it, they take the liability. But there's a little bit more complexity to this, which fundamentally gets to why the system's rigged against merchants. Initially, when the systems were created, as Yitz said, in the 50s and before, the acquiring and issuing entities were typically the same bank. Over time, it's fragmented, and the issuing and the acquiring banks became separate entities, or they became very separate within the big banks. What this has meant is that we're stuck with the legacy, though. Initially, as the banks set this up, the merchant acquiring businesses were typically loss leaders for the card issuing businesses. As it got fragmented, that model stayed in place largely. Now, as we talk about this rigging today, we're going to talk about the fact that it kind of comes into two categories. There's a variety around the economics, and that is that things like merchants don't know what it costs them to accept a card when they accept a card, that very often they're paying interchange plus, they're paying for the interchange on a card, and if the card turns out to be a reward card or a corporate card or some other special program, they pay a premium for it, but they don't know it when they accept the card. Additionally, there's a whole variety of processing fees that the merchants end up wearing. The part that we're going to focus on for this presentation, the part that Yitz and I are excited about, is a place where we can actually help make a big difference. And this is related to the fact that the associations and the industry as a whole is working very hard to give the merchants tools to kind of correct this imbalance. The things that we're looking at, if you stay on the last slide for 1 second, the things that we're considering are, how do we help with the liability on chargebacks? How do we give merchants the tools so they can do all the right things so the liability sits with the issuer? How can merchants further reduce their fraud by looking at things like fraud tools, while at the same time not suffering from too many false declines? Sam, thank you. Initially, when in the 50s, when credit cards were created, one of the unanticipated at the time benefits was it enabled mail order, telephone order, or MODO. At this point in time, in the 50s when this started, the merchant took all the risk for that. The issuer said, look, I'll approve this transaction, but if you can't send me a credit card slip, if you can't send me a signature, you, Mr. Merchant, bear the risk. Now, that was good because up until this point, the only way merchants could do mail order, telephone order was accepting cash in the mail or checks. By accepting credit cards, their business kind of grew and exploded, which was a good thing, but it wasn't sufficient. Over time, there were a variety of tools put in place to help manage the fraud, which started growing at this point. The first problem they needed to address was that anyone could dumpster dive outside of a restaurant and get the carbon copy from a credit card slip into a MODO transaction. So what the associations did at that point was they added this CVC value. That is the number that's printed on your card, typically in the signature panel, that isn't embossed. So an embossed imprint of the card wouldn't have the CVC. You needed the actual card or the embossing and the CVC to do a Moto transaction. This helped reduce fraud. Additionally, being able to provide the address of the cardholder using an AVS system by one of the associations helped validate that you knew not only that you physically had the card, but you knew something. So you had something and you know something. And that premise of having and knowing something kind of is the basis of security today. Additionally, they built a variety of tools to help merchants out, like the ABU tool. The ABU tool from Mastercard and its Visa equivalent basically allow a merchant that has cards on file to check whether the card's been updated or replaced. And this means that a merchant with card on file, as long as they meet the program participation requirements, being low risk and a good customer, they can avoid having someone that has a card on file that's expired not be able to complete the transaction. All these tools were all well and good, they were helpful, but merchants were still, as you had said earlier, paying a premium and still bearing the liability. So they were getting the worst of both worlds at this point. So in the early aughts, late 90s, they created 3D Secure version 1. 3D Secure version 1 was the Payment Association's effort to shift the liability from the merchant to the issuing banks. Now, whether it was branded at the time Secure Code or from Mastercard or verified by Visa, now both of those names have been replaced, it was a really good idea, and it was a really fundamentally sound approach in that merchants could now help the cardholders get in contact with their banks, provide some validation information so that the merchant could do the transaction with a high degree of confidence it wouldn't be charged back, a high degree of confidence that the transaction would remain and not be refunded. You know, it was a great idea. However, what they didn't anticipate is the amount of friction it created. The issuers got to control how they reached back out to the cardholders and check that they were really them. And those issuer pop-ups that happened at the time with 3DS version 1 were just horrific. They looked like old DOS windows opening up. It looked, quite frankly, like the fraud consumers were trying to avoid. And as a result, there was a lot of cart abandonment. Now, in some markets around the world, it was mandated, and those pop-ups got a little bit better, but largely 3DS kind of languished for a very long time until the associations were able to update this. So with the advent of mobile commerce, with the connectivity getting cheaper and quicker for everyone, the associations released a second version of 3D Secure called V2, which was effective a year or so ago. This included a lot richer data set, which means that the issuer can make a better decision, which means the issuer has to query the cardholder less frequently. So 3D Secure does many things better than 3D Secure version 1, that is, 3D Secure version 2 does many things better than 3D Secure version 1. Among them, it officially creates something called frictionless checkout, where the cardholder isn't going to get that pop-up. Lastly, the associations, trying to get a bit ahead of the curve, realized that while all of these wallets in the marketplace, whether they're MasterPass or the Visa wallet or the Amex wallet or the PayPal wallet, while they're good and they provide benefit to merchants, it is very difficult for a merchant to integrate with a dozen different branded wallets. EMV came out with a spec called SRC, which will be effectively a wallet of wallets. This does two things for the merchant. First, on their integration, it's one integration, not multiple integrations. Second, it enables the merchant to accept credit cards, accept wallets, and not have to store the card numbers, which is a good benefit. Now, this spec is relatively new. It's been out, I think, less than a year, and it's just starting to get some traction. As it grows and gets traction, it's a really good alternative for merchants looking to accept wallets, but do it in a seamless, simple way and not have to store credit card numbers.
Thank you, Adam. So in terms of what Pay offers merchants, so we are a 3DS provider. There's four main benefits for it. The first is the chargeback liability shift. So in this sense, it kind of mimics a card present, where if you use 3DS, and there is a chargeback for fraud, it's actually shifted to the issuing bank. This is especially effective in the friendly fraud side, because majority of those transactions work via risk base, and the issuer assumes the liability in those transactions. What that means is that there's no dispute that you have to jump through. The chargeback never hits your account, so besides not losing the actual money, you also don't get hit up with a chargeback fee, and it doesn't count towards your chargeback ratio, so it keeps that mid nice and healthy. One of the nice things about 2.0 that it does that 1.0 didn't do is that the authentication side of 3DS is actually connected to the authorization side of a transaction, which means that by utilizing 3DS, you're actually going to increase your approvals. So you should see, once you implement 2.0, an increase of between 2 to 7% on average of approvals. You also don't have to spend as much on other fraud tools that'll cause you to have a lot of false declines. Remember, the one thing about 3DS is it's network level protection, and it's all happening risk-based. So it allows you to only have to run like certain high-risk transactions through additional fraud tools. And then most of all, the last thing is it has zero impact on your customer experience. It's a completely frictionless experience. So that means whatever your customer's experience is now before using 3DS, once you implement our 3DS, it's going to stay exactly the same way, and it will not change anything in any way, and has zero conversion issues.
All right, thank you, Adam and Yit. So during your talk, we had a couple questions come through. I'm going to take this time to read them aloud, and then I will let you guys answer. So the first one I will send over to Adam. It says, in the slide with the roadmap, you said V1 had friction, but on the last slide, Yit said it is frictionless. Can you explain?
Thank you. That's a great question. EMV version 1, as it was written, said that if the issuer didn't participate in the program, the merchant could still get the benefit. And if the issuer participated in the program and didn't want to have a pop-up for the cardholder, the merchant can get a benefit from the program. We took advantage of the way the spec was written and the way the associations implemented it in Pay when we did our implementation in version 1, in that we set up the implementation so that the merchant got the benefit of 3D Secure when the merchant didn't participate. The merchant got the benefit of 3D Secure when the merchant did participate and didn't have a pop-up for the cardholder. And in the instance where the merchant did have a pop-up, we hid that from the merchant. So they may not have gotten the benefit of 3D Secure, but they got to complete the transaction anyway. So we effectively emulated what is now officially released as frictionless in 3D Secure version 2. 3D Secure version 2 looked at what we did and said, that's a good idea. And they institutionalized it when they came out with this version 2 of the 3D Secure spec. So now there is literally a frictionless transaction flow in the spec, largely replicating what we had done previously.
Thank you. All right, so the next question is for Yit. If 3DS shifts the liability, why do I need other fraud tools?
Thanks. So that's a good question. While I always say that 3DS should be your first line of defense against fraud, it should not be your only one. One of the things 3DS is especially effective in the friendly fraud arena, but with risk-based in the 2.0 right now, you're only going to see it protecting about 95 to 98% of transactions. So that means potentially there's a 2 to 5% of transactions that it's not going to get protected. Generally, when it comes to true fraud, it only makes up about 0.25% of all transactions, which means that you're still going to see some false positives in there if you decide to prompt. So if you want to protect the remaining 2 to 5% of it, the best thing to do is to use other fraud tools out there that complement 3DS really well. The other thing that 3DS doesn't do, and this doesn't necessarily relate directly to the question about fraud, but other chargeback tools, is that 3DS only protects against fraud. There are other tools out there that can protect against other chargebacks. And if you want to keep your MID as healthy as possible and reduce all chargebacks, because generally what the card brands look at are your chargeback ratios, not just your fraud ratios. It's best to utilize other tools that can help you fight some of those other chargebacks.
Sam, you're muted.
Oh, my bad. Okay, there's one more question that came in. I will let Adam take this one. It is, can you explain how risk-based authentication works?
Sure. What this means is you provide the issuer with a large amount of information, and the issuer is going to base their response to that request on the risk of this transaction. Now, with the advent of AI and machine learning, those systems that do the risk-based analysis are getting quite sophisticated. Now, it's interesting as you study AI and machine learning, which are really buzzwords of the day. If you're writing your LinkedIn profile or your resume today, those are great ways to stimulate interest from the recruiters. But those terms are really old school for the banks. The banks have been using systems like this for quite some time. What's new here for 3D Secure in version 2 is they've moved those fraud tools out of solely the authorization engine and moved them into the 3D Secure ACS, so that when they do the ACS decision about whether this should be frictionless or not, they have all this additional information and all these good metrics to measure against about you, your spending habits, this merchant, the environment you're in, the IP you're at, and hundreds of other data elements, which they then weigh in their decision about the transaction. So they're truly weighing the risk before they make a decision.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. I don't see any more questions coming in, but please don't hesitate to reach out to Adam or Yitz directly. You can also contact me, samantha@pay.co, if anything comes up afterwards. We will follow up with a copy of the slide deck as well as the webinar.